Good afternoon and welcome to another live broadcast from the QSITE 2015 conference. We're here with our next keynote, so Max Lenoy, who shared a little bit about Aboriginal culture and identity, and also a project to do with augmented reality, challenged our perceptions, and also gave us some food for thought about how we can incorporate those identities into our teaching.
Max certainly pushed the boundaries for a lot of teachers there. We felt uncomfortable and we had to fess up to what we didn't know. Thank you, Max.
You're welcome.
And why we didn't know it.
Yes. Yeah.
Max, what is it that teachers can do? Because we know about the disadvantage, but sometimes teachers are unsure about the role they can play in actually teaching students about Indigenous culture, especially when they don't see themselves as being experts at it.
I think I made the reference that I'm married to a Torres Strait Islander, but I would never actually call myself a Torres Strait Islander expert. I've grown up with Torres Strait Islanders all my life. So it's something that I think we accept the fact that we will never be considered experts. I had a professor once tell me that if someone ever tells you that they're an expert in Indigenous education, to do two things: turn around and run. So I would not ever say that I was an expert in Indigenous education, and I don't expect anyone to become an expert in it. There are certainly knowledge keepers in our community, and that's who we need to talk to. And hopefully I shared some ways of, through technology, through country or the community in which you are learning on the school grounds, that you can connect with the community that has that knowledge. And that's the first step.
There was some interest in the two images that you put up, but people can Google them. One was the breakdown of the language maps. That was by a very early anthropologist who was doing some research in the different cultures. The second one grabbed me because you actually put the names of those cultures there and took away some of the borders. And then I realized that there was a fluidity that we sometimes take for granted when we look at those European maps of where boundaries are. Can you describe that kind of world that teachers were challenged with?
I think most of us see the diversity of Indigenous people across the country, but don't understand the reason why there was diversity as well. And I think the David Horton map that I showed, which is available through on the internet, but there's a nice ABC website that allows you to zoom in on different language groups. And it really demonstrates how distinctive we are. I get my students to think about, well, what other parts of the world are very distinctive? And they think of Europe and Asia. And I say, well, in Europe, most people kind of have the similar kind of pigment in terms of they're mostly white. But you would never call a Greek person Italian. You'd never make the error of calling an Irish person English,
or just those Europeans.
Yeah, you know. And so, and I hope that people remember this as well. You know, we're not ATSI. We are not ATSI. We've never been ATSI. We're Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people. We use thousands of words every day. We should extend it to distinguish the difference between both very different groups. So by having them see the maps, by having them see that the language was very much part of our connection to country, it explained the sense that, you know, we weren't a group that went and conquered other country. There was no reason why I would want your land, because your identity, your culture, your language is connected to that space. So why would I want that? And it also reinforces as to why we do an acknowledgement of country. If we're from somewhere else and we're coming into someone's house on their country, we would ask where the toilet is. We'd ask, okay, do you want me to take my shoes off? We're being polite and recognizing that this is, and always will be their country. So it's just general practices like that demonstrate how we can, in a small step, recognize the importance of place in our lives and theirs.
I remember taking my scout group to it was an Indian temple, and they were terrified about entering. They didn't feel like they'd been formally invited. Right. They didn't understand, but I think more importantly, they didn't want to offend. And so there was a sense of inaction. Do you think that that's where perhaps teachers are fearful about engaging with some of the Indigenous issues and topics, because they don't feel that they understand enough and they're frightened of perhaps offending by getting it wrong?
Yeah, I agree. I think that's the major barrier that most teachers would explain. they have and they're dealing with Indigenous knowledges. And they're more than happy to take part in some activities where there's a minimal engagement sometimes with people, such as either painting a boomerang or learning about art, dot making art and such. But I think when we are always in an uncomfortable place when we're learning, and I think learning happens best in that space. And I think certainly the important element of every experience when learning with Indigenous people is about doing two very Indigenous learning styles. The first one is, and Epithecus, one of the Greek scholars, said this as well, and a lot of elders tell me this every time I go on country, Jitterbal mob mostly, you're given two ears and one mouth for a reason. So if the Greeks and the elders in the Aboriginal community had the same saying, we should actually follow it. That we need to listen more than we actually talk. And also, just by being quiet and being on country, it allows you to get a sense of what you need to ask. And so I shared that story about an auntie of mine being out in the Walpuri desert, and just asked the question, and for 2 hours had no response. And asked this elder, why don't you have any didgeridoos here? Why don't your mob make didgeridoos? And it took 2 hours for him to respond, and she thought he'd forgotten. Oh, he's old. And he just asked her to consider the environment, and that was, well, where's the trees? So we need to actually practice that listening, and more importantly, being quiet. There's a big difference between them. So that's something that every teacher can put in place. I don't have to change the world with this lesson, but I can actually go and find out how I can acknowledge the place where I am, and then teach students to respect that as well.
So do you think that's really quite difficult in a classroom kind of space and setting? What kind of strategies do you have for schools to, even within their own grounds, get that space?
Yeah, well, I suppose in teaching a technology unit at the moment to the university students, we're teaching design and technology as the curriculum subject area. And yeah, we've got a beautiful teal room, a technology enhanced active learning space. I think so Margaret Marys is thinking about creating one as well. I want to check it out. And it's from MIT, and it's small groups working around technology with whiteboards and interactive spaces, so they can do a number of really amazing things with technology. But the activity I gave them on Friday last week is that they had to make a model house, and they weren't allowed to use any man-made products.
Wow.
So we could actually, they spent 20 minutes finding the products outside, trees, branches, leaves, rocks, bits of wood. And then they came in and they made it using design thinking framework. So they had to understand what the task was. They didn't have to, so we used the Stanford design thinking process. And then they had to apply Indigenous principles behind it as well. And so that allows us to make that link between design and technology, and a design method that's been here for 60,000 years. And that's, okay, where do we build it if we have wind flow? Where do we build it if we're in the summer or in the wet season up this way? And so it just allowed them to take those factors into consideration. So even though we have one of the most technical spaces in North Queensland with a teal room, a technology enhanced active learning space, we could still go and say, well, how do we look at technology from an Indigenous perspective? How do we make a boomerang with an uncle and learn what the technology is of having it work using design thinking processes? So it's possible, and I think it's just challenging ourselves to say, how do we do this? And I love that space of curriculum, saying, how do I now embed technology into my current practice, but more so, how do I build it into my current pedagogy and have it evident in my practice? But
And Max, what I found really interesting when you spoke to us earlier was a lot of people say that they find it difficult teaching technology to put that Indigenous perspective on the technology's curriculum. But I thought you made the point quite nicely that technology goes beyond that physical product, that technology is about practices and knowledge and systems. And when you broaden your thinking about what technology is, then it's much easier to do that connection with Indigenous perspectives.
Yeah. So and that's a really good example of, well, we didn't just survive on this country, we thrived. We used the resources to maximize life. And I remember reading an article by an anthropologist when I was at university, and he said that one of the clear distinctions that the early settlers of Sydney made was that they deemed Aboriginal people to be lazy. He realized, in looking at this document 200 years later, that what he discovered was that they had the best system of working designed for humans.
Yes.
And that it would be hunting in the morning and designing spaces. If you read Bill Gambage's book on the largest estate on earth, he described how the Aboriginal people, and he makes a distinction that he believes there's more trees in Australia now than what there was when white people came to Australia. So he said that, you know, there's old images, paintings and drawings of beautiful landscaped runs of grass with beautiful, I suppose, and that's why he said it was like an Englishman's garden. When the early settlers to Brisbane and Sydney arrived, they saw these landscape spaces of grass with trees framing these beautiful runs of grass. That was because they were hunting spaces. So the best way to hunt kangaroo was to, in the morning, as you know, with kangaroos, that's when they feed. So you hide in the trees, you burn off the grass, you make sure that it's nice and clear, you hunt for kangaroo, and you spend the heat of the day relaxing.
That's right. Yeah. And then probably more sensible than probably the Anglos running around with hankies tied in the corners on their head.
Yeah. So there was a system it was a maximized system of hunting, fish traps, fire stick farming. Gregory, there's two Gregory brothers that did a lot of exploring up this way in Queensland. And the second Gregory brother, that was not as famous as the first one, in their diaries they wrote they found grain storage made out of trees that were 2 tons. And another anthropologist showed that Aboriginal people created a takeaway system. So if you saw a tree that had mud built up into the crevice of that tree, the hollow of that tree, then you could crack the mud and grab out a little Johnny cake wrapped in a palm leaf. And then you have to reciprocate by making more, putting it back and sealing it up. And so there was ways that you could travel through the country and pretty much get takeaway on the way. So these are systems. Awesome. These are systems that exist, and we need to be aware that they are ways you can show all the transportation systems. Same as in in Canada, USA, many of the systems of road across Australia are built on the Aboriginal travel paths. We use the same path, you know, especially Cardwell north of here. Yes. The same Dalrymple track is what was the Aboriginal track, and he just decided to name it after himself. Mitchell grass, that grows a lot in Queensland, is named after Mitchell because he saw 16 kilometres of agriculture, of Aboriginal people tending to this Mitchell grass. And there was huge 16 kilometres that he rode through. And the only thing he did was to recognise that Aboriginal people were used agriculture. And his lasting legacy was to name the grass after himself. Yeah, so
that seems to be, should have applied proper referencing.
Yeah, exactly.
That seems to be something that we fall into a trap of, that we mislabel things. It's when you describe food as dessert or as junk food, or now I can apply geocaching to the idea of actually putting a secret thing away that you can come back to and discover. And I realized that I'd mislabeled in the last question that you had the idea that we've had trade relations with Asia through the Indigenous community for hundreds of years, but we didn't label it like that. And is that a danger that we apply today's measuring ruler to try to measure the past, that we need to be open-minded and a bit more inclusive in the way that we look at these groups?
Yeah, I think that's the main change that we as teachers can implement, that we are looking at the world not through what we were taught, but what we can now relearn.
Yeah.
The knowledge is out there. If you look at the internet, there's David Suzuki last week. Dr. David Suzuki came out and said that the way we achieve sustainability is not through science, but through Indigenous people. And I think that's a transformation. You've got the CSIRO now saying, yeah, we know we've stuffed up in how we run this country and the plant systems. We need to relearn how to learn about Indigenous ways of managing land, water, and other resources. So, yeah, that's the challenge we have, I think, and it is achievable by actually thinking about relabeling this information as being not something that was colonization, but pre-existent, pre-colonization, and currently still being practiced. Uncle Russell, I was trying to get Uncle Russell, who is the main person who engages with our AR project, to come, but he's actually up at Hinchinbrook on his country, Hinchinbrook Island, is with about 20 Americans, I understand, and he's teaching them Indigenous knowledge and having a nice little laugh at the same time, because they're doing survival practices, you know. So he's
sure that'll be entertaining.
exactly. You know, he teaches them. He says he teaches them first how to find wild honey, and then has to teach them. I show them the medicine of how to stop their stomachs from rumbling the next day. So this is all current practices that we can engage at our place of learning, our schools, and then by putting in place yarning circles, putting in place respectful practices such as acknowledging the traditional owners on a daily basis and recognising that we are standing on privileged space. That's a wonderful way we can make a small step.
So can you tell me a little bit more about this yarning circles idea?
The yarning circles or dialogue circles have been part of the, I suppose, the space, the teaching space, discussion space for at least 10 to 15 years. And yarning circles are very much an opportunity to use an Indigenous pedagogical teaching strategy. So what happens is that if we were in a yarning circle now, we would use a device that would be our talking stick.
Could be. Is it usually a penguin puppet or not?
I don't know if you'd be able to grab a scrub turkey.
I've got a kangaroo over there.
I don't know if you want to hold a taipan or something like that, but we can use a puppet for now. And so what it would mean with it, Roland would then be the person talking. And as I was saying to you guys as we were coming up the steps, what we get our students to practice is not to use a device or even pen and paper, that in order to practice developing our Indigenous learning skills, is to actually to be quiet and to listen and to remember. Now, we didn't have there were certainly message sticks that would have symbols that would then be sent to different groups to transfer a message, but our language was very oral only. So that required us to remember. And so by using the yarning circle, you're getting students to learn to shut up and listen and active listening. Because it does come down to survival. Whenever we have walks on country with Uncle Russell, we've always got kids there, and kids are the most attentive out of everyone, because they're not trying to remember it for a purpose of remembering so they can tell their friends, in many cases, or trying to do it as an assignment or such. They're remembering because they understand how because they're close to the ground in many cases, how it has meaning for them. Wow, I just learned about this plant, and it's a calendar tree. It'll tell me when the season changes, and it also is a signal tree because it'll explain when we go and hunt barramundi. And they have a connection with that story, and they remember it more than adults. So I think that's because they understand the importance, and they've, I suppose, less time on the land, and they're closer to that sense of, well, I have to listen more than actually talk. So as at the yarning circle, then we take part in sharing the animal around, and we'd all listen. And it's a wonderful tool for a reflective task.
So do you have to set a context beforehand?
I think so. As I said, I've never recorded many of the yarning circles that we've had in our outdoor Indigenous teaching space, because they become very emotional. Because you can share how it has meaning for you. And so that's a different kind of discussion to what did I learn from that. No, this makes sense now. And it doesn't have to be just about Indigenous content, if that makes sense. So a yarning circle can be about any topic, any concept. And by using the yarning circle, and sometimes when you're on country doing it, it makes a difference. So we've had pediatric nurses take part in the yarning circle. We've had scientists, and by just talking about it and having to be heard rather than try to argue with someone, it makes more sense and meaning for them. So they share, well, how is this important for me, and without any interruptions. But it also caters for different learning styles. So if you are an introverted person, as we agreed that we are, then it allows us to say, well, no, I'm okay. I'll pass it on. Whereas if you're extroverted, then someone's keeping you to the confines. And you find with extroverts, sometimes when they talk too much, they realize it, like I do now. So, and so it's like, okay, I need to share. So time doesn't become a factor then, because they realize they're in a group and they have to share, but they have to share the time as well.
And you reminded me that time of sharing, there's two. There's the oral sharing, which is without the technology, where the kids are challenged sometimes to just go and actually build in their house with stuff around. But there's also the technology with sharing, where we can capture that knowledge and then we could pass it on to another generation and make it real by not just having a picture of someone describing a tree, but I'm actually going to put a video, an interactive one too.
Yeah.
I've also got a couple of guests here in our studio.
They were too shy to be on camera, but we do have an audience.
And there's an opportunity, an opportunity to ask some questions.
Do you think the success of Queensland has of helping Aboriginal students get through to finishing 12 is because a lot of schools are bringing elders in to talk to the students? I know we do at our school. We have a young circle. We have a boys dance group and a girls dance group, and they perform at all of our sporting groups and all of that sort of stuff. So do you think it's part of that is that we're actually bringing elders in to show respect to the culture in front of the students as well?
So just in case the audio is a bit over there. So the question was I guess the success of Queensland in terms of the way Aboriginal culture is incorporated and the benefits to Aboriginal students. Do you think that is because of the presence of elders in that process in the classroom?
Yeah, and I think specifically I identified that we as a state bring the national completion rate for Year 12 Indigenous students up above the 50% mark. And so that's contributed to that is the fact that we have elders in the community participating in the school community, but also Indigenous education workers and CECs. And also I know of a lot of non-Indigenous teachers who have that passion to teach Indigenous kids about the non-Indigenous game we call education. And I think that's the strength. But certainly elders are a very important one. We've had elders and residents in a number of schools, and I think it works really effectively. I think there's still a gap because we still, and I know elders are very conscious of that, because we had it even here at the school a couple of weeks ago where students will say, yeah, I know I'm Aboriginal, but I don't know how or who I am. I don't know who my people are. And that's a strong position that a school, elders, CCs, but even non-Indigenous staff can help facilitate that exploration of finding out who they are and their connection to a place. So I think it's growing, and we certainly have a lot to be mindfully thankful of the effort, but I think we also need to remind ourselves that our state education Indigenous perspectives document was the last out of all the states and territories. So the ITSEP document for Education Queensland, I'm very proud to say that in '97 I was part of the team that put together the diocese Catholic Education Indigenous Perspectives document. But and at that point we had only just beaten Tasmania by about a month in '97, and whereas South Australia have been doing it since '82, embedding Indigenous knowledges, and not just as a perspectives-based approach of how can we tie it into science, how can we tie it into geography. No, there was an Aboriginal studies program designed by an Aboriginal person from Queensland, from Cunnamulla, Barry Ridderford. He went down there and became the Director of Indigenous Education, and he put together an Aboriginal studies program that ran from prep all the way through to Year 12. So, even though, as they say, Queenslanders go and do amazing things in other places, that is certainly the case with Indigenous education. So we have a long way to go, but we can hold our heads up saying that we've got people on the ground that help. One of the other groups that wasn't identified, and it's pretty much Townsville-based only now. I don't think they run it in Cairns, but that's the ACCELN, having ACCELN programs. And so ACCELN stands for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Aspirations Program. So it gets years 5, 6 and 7, or 5 and 6 now, and also years 10, 11 and 12. Indigenous students then take part in some competitions and they learn about their identity, they learn about how to do some academic challenges, and it's just an opportunity for them to get together with each other and to say, yeah, we can actually do some really academic things. And that's proven to be very successful. All of those students from the QSITE function that happened here, the foundation function, all of those were at ACCELN, and they're saying, yep, I'm going to be a doctor, I'm going to be a nurse, I'm going to be a teacher. And it's because they were inspired to do that. And so that only happens in Queensland, and now only happens in the Townsville district. So I'm encouraging you, we had the 2 high schools from Rockhampton drive up to be part of ACCELN because it wasn't existing in there. So we can make a big difference, and certainly elders are an integral part.
Yeah, absolutely.
Thank you, Judy. Anyone else?
Yeah, look, I
Tim.
get to go to New Zealand every so often with my current job, and one thing that struck me in the early times to go to New Zealand in the last couple of years is how their Indigenous culture is so integrated with education. Everywhere you go, every school, every university is either a Maori temple or some sort of real integration. And I thought, why are we so far behind here in Australia in terms of our integration?
That's-
Comments about that?
That's a good question. So Tim was asking about the why the Maori culture in New Zealand is so deeply integrated in their education system, and we're the laggards and still catching up.
Well, I think we kind of addressed it today in the presentation, and I think most people would recall that we are the only nation out of Australia and New Zealand, Australia, New Zealand, Canada and USA. We don't have any treaties with Aboriginal people. And I think that's the remarkable difference. The Treaty of Waitangi ensures that the Maori people have their language taught in school. They have an economic base based on land management. In 2000, the year 2000, they used Waitangi to actually determine spectra rights. Now that means that every group that wants to open a brand new radio station, and you know there's lots of money going through radio stations, that they have to pay via Waitangi a payment for the opportunity to use the airspace over New Zealand to show their radio shows. So that creates an economic base for them to then put it. But it is purely because they have a treaty of Waitangi that allows them to make sure it is evident. Now, you may not be familiar, but yeah, we did have, there was a couple of treaty attempts here in Australia. The most recent one was in 1987, when leading up to the bicentennial times, Prime Minister Hawke wanted to have a treaty with Aboriginal people. It went into the too hard basket, and then it became what was called a compact, and then ended up being what's called the decade of reconciliation. That's kind of lasted for 20 years now. Yeah, so that's the main reason why we don't have a treaty, and hence why there's some resistance towards the Recognise campaign of actually having Indigenous people part of the Constitution, because Terra Nullius and the Mabo decision made it distinctively clear that internationally we are the sovereign owners of this land, that there's no treaties with each of the language groups. And the other major thing that the Maori education program has, look up the Maori Potential program, and it really changes the mindset of how we look at diversity and difference in culture. And you'll know yourselves as teachers, when the curriculum used to teach for Indigenous people, or the practice used to teach that Indigenous people are a deficit, that they have English as a second or fourth language, and so that's why they aren't able to learn English and then effectively work in the school setting. And what the Maori Potential program says is, well, no, we're distinctive. And so Indigenous people are distinctive. Yes, English is our fourth language. I speak a different language at home than what I speak here. It's still English, but I use Aboriginal English. Western Australia recognised Aboriginal English back in the 80s. Education Queensland recognised Aboriginal English as a way that Indigenous people talk at home in 2012. Before that, we were thinking, no, they can't speak English. I've got teachers who say to me, I have to actually have a panel when I get home because I don't talk like this at home, and I have to concentrate every word that comes out of my mouth. So we need to recognise those major differences. And the other difference as well is that for the Maori Potential program, we're actually trying to use diversity and distinctiveness as a strength.
Yes.
where we exclude it. And the recent paper, the Australian on the weekend, said we're just going to only have Indigenous issues and knowledges embedded in history, art, and geography. So,
but you've just, in your presentation and in our discussions, you've explained science and technology and how it's the label is different from the assigned Australian curriculum, but it's still there. It's just how we define it. We understand it.
And I think too, I teach astronomy now differently from the way I used to teach it. And I take the kids out, I'm doing it in Canberra actually. I'm looking forward to taking them up to Stromlo. And the first thing I'm pointing out is not the constellations, but it's going to be the giant emu. It'll stick it in my mind. So there's a group who saw the dust lanes because they could see so many stars and gave it the name. I'm also thinking that we're going to be the richer if we can embrace this and accept it as part of our heritage and a part of our understanding. And we're also going to make the Indigenous communities and people with that background richer by understanding them. The quote that I think that you gave was that if we don't take the trouble to understand someone's culture and the past trouble that we've placed them into, how can we understand them as a people and see where they fit into our society?
Yeah, no, I agree. I mean, that's the whole premise of why we're reinforcing this, is that it can be part of the curriculum, because teachers have a remarkable role in transforming students. And so if you know, I know through my teachers, through my Mr. Christensen, Mrs. Treadray, Mrs. Weber, and Deborah Backer, and those teachers who said, you know, don't be ashamed of who you are. You know, that's the distinctiveness that you have. Bring it out. You know, so in being encouraged. I remember one of my teachers told me once, when I found out that a lot of the language divides were watershed lines, so mountain ranges, rivers and creeks. And I found that out through reading a book. And I told him, and he said, "Oh, Indigenous people weren't that smart." And you know, that the difference that a teacher can make, and actually saying, I want to recognise how that knowledge can be imported into my knowledge, but also my practice, that I'm respectful of Indigenous knowledges, and that I don't have to know everything in order to teach it, but by caring, as I think was the paraphrase you made, if I show how much I care, then it doesn't matter how much I know right now.
And that idea of who you are is being so important, embracing that.
Yeah, and I think, and that's when I have my students go through what a program called Kenyini. I'm not sure if you've heard of Kenyini, but Kenyini is Kanyini, but it teaches you to actually think of yourself through an Indigenous lens.
Yes.
In many cases, non-Indigenous people, and I've had PhD students say this to me, well, I can't write about culture because I don't have a culture. So you do have a culture, you just haven't analysed who you are. You know, look at your surname. It's not just, it's not blank. It's not just A. You come from somewhere. You have a history of connectedness to somewhere. So if we connect them to land, we connect them to their family, how they are who they are because of their family. And then they've got a spirituality. Even if they're agnostic or atheist, that's still a spirituality, a lack of an acceptance that there is one, and that's fine. And then we take them through what's called their family values. So what values do you uphold? So once they have those 4 areas of connectedness through an Indigenous lens, I strip them of it. I turn the lights down and I say, okay, now you're on my mission. I'm the actual warden of this mission. You're no longer allowed to go back to that country. So whatever place you feel is home to you, you no longer will see your family. The people sitting next to you will be your family. I'll be your father. I don't care what your spiritual belief is. You now believe what I believe. And your values will be beaten into you from what I believe they are. And when students go through that, they see how Indigenous people are very much disconnected even from their own country, family. And so just if you can see that element of, if you're conscious of that these kids in many cases may be broken, and the word is very much severed from their culture, from their identity, and you have a distinctive role to facilitate that connection. And I mentioned during the talk, I've had 8 students who have said, yeah, Grandma mentioned that we've got, skeleton in the closet. I'm going to find out more.
That's
And when
fair.
they do that searching, they then find they have got they've got a connection to country. By teaching students, everyone, that they can connect. You have a special place that you call Australia, and you have a special place there that you call home here, then you can understand an Indigenous way of connecting. And I don't mind if your people aren't from here, but if you've got a special connection to this place, you can then have an understanding of connectedness that Indigenous people have.
That's a really powerful message to leave for teachers, and I want to thank you very much for having come today. Thank you for the questions from the audience, and some really big takeaways. Thank you very much, mate.
Thank you.
Thank you. You show appreciation?
Thank you.